is about highlighting and addressing specific challenges on or concerns faced by a particular region to bring local or regional issues to the attention of global audience, right? So this is what it is about. Now we are talking about Hindu Kush Himalaya cryosphere. So of course it is about bringing the issues, challenges, the changes that are happening in Hindu Kush Himalaya region related to cryosphere to global audience. And the question is, why do we need to do that? What are the benefits of doing that? That is basically, there are a number of things, but it is actually for, raising awareness, fostering awareness within global community. Of course, looking for opportunities to collaborate, and then also, more importantly, look for possibilities, potentials of solutions, right? We have challenges, and therefore we need solutions. So these are some of the things we think we can get because of profiling regional issues in global platform. Right. Okay. So that is what we are trying to do. Now, what is important in my view? What is important when we are trying to do is basically to highlight the importance of regional issues, right, to global audience. Now, what does it mean? It means, what are the vulnerability issues, right? What are the changes happening in this region, and why it is making the people and the environment vulnerable? I think this is something which we really have to be, communicating. More importantly, of course, we can talk about the vulnerabilities and challenges, but more importantly, when we are talking to the global community, I think the interdependencies and interlinkages are very important. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. And then also it is very important to project the cause and effect relationship of what is happening here, right? What is happening here in terms of drought, in terms of flood, in terms of many different things happening, what is actually driving it? I think that is something which is really important to be conveyed, right? Some ideas, not being very exhaustive, is, for example, impact of water resources. For 1.9 billion people living in this region and downstream, right? This is a statement which we always use, quite a lot of time we use, and it becomes very powerful message which is based on good evidence. This is one example which really attracts the attention of global community. That what I mean is that we should have something big. Small things are important, but big things attract attention. That's one. The second, perhaps very important thing that we can highlight is the cryosphere in this region acts like a barometer of climate change or thermometer of climate change. It actually tells the health of not only this region, but also the whole world. I think that is one important factor. And of course, bringing in, the stories related to loss of species, loss of, ecosystem, species, habitat. This also brings in very important messaging, right? So that means we need to go beyond the discipline of cryosphere and water, but also bring in ecosystem and other things, right? So these are some of the highlights that actually are important. Now, of course, let's talk about some of the challenges, right? Of course, these are all good, but we have not been able to do it effectively. So what are the challenges? Not again going very exhaustively, a few of those. First and foremost, I think is communication barrier, right? Most of us are scientists, and scientists are not necessarily a good communicator. So I think there is the first important factor is to improve our communication skill and turn very, very complicated science result into simple, understandable, information. That is number one. The second thing is critical mass. I think one scientist talking, one person talking will not have that kind of impact. So we really need critical mass. Mountain population is very small. Mountain interest groups are small. So only mountain talking about this will not have a big impact. So I think that is second point I would like to mention here, and I'll talk about how to overcome those challenges later on. Data and evidences. We are, still not having enough evidence, right? And we need evidence on what is happening. Anecdotal evidences are good, but data-driven evidences are very important. So these are some of the challenges that hinder proper attention in global platform. So what can we do to overcome those challenges? And here comes the importance of forum like CryoHub, HKH CryoHub. Because we have not enough mass, not enough people talking in the same language, in the same voice, and giving the same information, I think that's the big problem. And the CryoHub can actually help. It is bringing together all the regional and even global international scientists and people working in this region. So have a common voice and common cause. There are other networks like CryoHub. I talked about Upper Indus Basin Network, CoCDRR Knowledge Hub, and others. We have not been able to very effectively utilize those networks to position ourselves in global platform. I think that's something which we can really do. Of course, I talked about communication. Science communication is very important. Data-driven storytelling, I think, is very, very important for impactful, communication. We heard about glacier art yesterday, and I really was struck by the kind of impression it has. I think that is another. We have to look for non-conventional kind of mechanism, ways of communicating. I think that is very important. And campaigning, that's another one very important. And also we heard quite a lot yesterday about International Year of Glacier Preservation. And that kind of campaigning can actually bring in a lot of attention in global platforms. So with that, what I would like to do is to call for action, actually. Of course, these are all good. I think we can talk about it further on. There are different examples, different ways to do it. But unless we do it, it will not happen, right? So again, I am bringing in this critical mass issue here. And I would like to remind about a philosophical principle, which was, postulated by someone called Hegel. He was a German philosopher, and one of his philosophy is called Hegel's dialectical process. I don't know how many of you have heard of this. Anyone? Yes, good, thanks. At least one person. So what it says is that, if you have certain quantity, it has the capacity to turn into a different quality, right? And this was mentioned probably in the context of politics. If you have large amount of number of people supporting something, you can have change in the system, right? But it is also very much valid in physics. For example, if you raise the temperature of water to 100 degrees Celsius under standard temperature and pressure, it converts to vapor, right? So the quantity actually converts to quality. And I think in our case also, if we have enough critical mass talking about this topic, we can make change. And I think that's what we can do through the CryoHub. And of course, for that, we need to strengthen the regional science and regional scientists. Capacity building is very important. And of course, for all that, sustained engagement. We cannot, do this with, one or two events, one or two meetings. We have to have planned and sustained, engagement. This is very important. So that's basically what I intended to say. But in closing, what I would like to say is that each of us hold the power to bring HKH region, this region's vital issues to the global stage by sharing stories, advocating for change, and amplifying local voices. We can ensure that challenges and opportunities of this region are recognized worldwide, right? I think we really believe. And CryoHub could be an excellent opportunity to profile Hindu Kush Himalaya cryosphere issues in global platform. And I urge you everyone and beyond to work on this. Let's work together on this issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Aaron, and you raised some very important points there about this call to action. And it's not just a one-time effort, it has to be a sustained effort. We're going to take the questions and the answers at the end of this session. So first we'll hear from our second speaker. And we're delighted to have Ms. Susanna Hancock. Oops. And Susanna Hancock has degrees from the University of Oxford. She's the Global Mountains Director with the International Cryosphere Climate Initiative, very interesting and important organization. And she's an interdisciplinary polar climate researcher, but was a former international elite athlete, so that's very useful when she does her field work. She now meets her athletic cravings by skiing across polar ice sheets and glaciers, during which she also collects data in conjunction with global research institutions. Thank you very much, Susanna.
That's as well.
Just
This one. Perfect. And then I can just. All right. Excellent. Well, thank you. My hearing. Okay, excellent. Thank you very much for having me here today. And I also, like Aaron, had some questions about what this TED Talk structure was. I have done a TED Talk before, but wasn't quite certain what we had meant about this. So thank you very much for having me. I'm also going to be talking about this transition into global platforms. We can talk a little bit about it from the ICCI perspective. So cryosphere traditionally has been, from a policy perspective, focused on the mountain regions, the polar regions, the Arctic, Antarctica, and that's kind of where we've left it. AR5 and SROC were instrumental in changing that because they both brought this focus to more of the global systems that are impacted, the global feedbacks that are impacted as a result of changes in the cryosphere. However, this system, sorry, I'm stepping on things. However, when we're talking as policymakers, we still haven't really made this transition. And we tend to, when we talk about cryosphere change, still focus on the polar regions and the mountains. Thus, there are several things that I feel are important. One is that we need to shift the dialogue. So we need to move, instead of speaking about cryosphere changes that happen within the cryosphere, talking about changes that happen from the cryosphere to global systems. And this can help us reiterate the need to reduce emissions drastically. So to reduce emissions by 50% by 2030, for example. To have the ambition so that we do not overshoot the Paris Agreement, because we can see this as a more global systemic topic. So I just have a couple slides that I'm just going to share, just knowing that people are speaking a lot of languages and having things written down. All right. So our main message with ICCI is that one cannot negotiate with the melting point of ice. And we engage in many global fora, specifically the UNFCCC fora around the world. So for example, the annual COP meetings, as well as some others. But we aim to bring to these meetings the motivation to increase ambitious climate action, especially as it relates to the losses of the cryosphere. We first brought our cryosphere pavilion to COP25, which is in Madrid in 2019. And there, our overall message was to focusing on the cryosphere, look at the difference in impacts that are significant between the 1.5 degrees and the 2 degrees set within the agreement, Paris Agreement. The following year, we went to COP26, sorry, 2 years later, the COVID, we went to COP26 in Glasgow, 2021. And there, our focus was to educate about the risks and implications about overshooting the Paris Agreement. So missing that 1.5, missing that 2. What would that mean? As part of this, we also launched our first State of the Cryosphere report, which we have launched every year since. We're gearing up for our 4th launch in a couple of months. And this is focusing on a very broad view of the cryosphere in general and looking at those global implications and then tailoring it towards policymakers, speaking directly towards decision makers. At COP26 and then also bleeding into COP27, Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, our focus was on the global implications of cryosphere melt, especially looking at regions that may not be seen by many to be closely associated, especially again, talking about policymakers where there is that difference between what's in the cryosphere versus what's affected by the cryosphere. So really to drive home regions of the world that are directly impacted but seem very distant. Through all of this, one of our overarching messages is that 1.5 degrees is absolutely necessary for the cryosphere and for its survival. But also this threshold is relevant for other global systems as well. So the coral reefs, the Amazonas region. So this is a threshold that we're benefited in some ways by other ecosystems also having a threshold at this level, because it helps us tie everything together, at least from a policy perspective. So this is some of the different science relevant UNFCCC negotiation tracks that we've been involved in. I won't speak about them, but just to list the different platforms there. So some of these successes in the recent COP meetings, COP26 in Glasgow, we got the first message of cryosphere in a decision text, in the cover text. It was in the preamble though, rather than the actionable text. But the text also went on to double down on the importance of 1.5 degrees versus 2 degrees. So the text coming out of Glasgow said that it recognizes the impacts of climate change will be much lesser with a temperature rise of 1.5 degrees compared with 2 degrees, and therefore resolves to pursue efforts to limit the temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. So this was significant in that it marked a change in ambition in targets, but it also was met by some legal pushback. The following year at COP27 in Egypt led to the Sharm el-Sheikh implementation plan. And here we did get cryosphere into the operational text. And the preamble from Glasgow and the need to maintain 1.5 degrees also stayed. This set us up for a very good stead going into COP28 in Dubai last December and led to a cryosphere workshop pre-sessionally that was open to every country, again, focusing on the global risks and the global implications of the changing cryosphere. And there were also throughout the event multiple opportunities to engage with the cryosphere in negotiations and discussions, in side panels, rounds. So this led us in some ways to being a bit optimistic about how we can continue to escalate the role of the cryosphere in these global policy plans. However, the text that came out of COP28 reverted back to the 2 degrees of warming, took out that 1.5 intermediate. And it also had there was a lot of debate right towards the end about the role of fossil fuels. So it ended up saying that it's going to be transitioning away from fossil fuels and effectively enshrined the need for transitional fuels such as LNG. One of the sticking points right at the end was the decision to use the term phasing out of unabated fuels such as coal rather than the phasing down. And that, along with the use of terms, the carbon capture, utilization, and storage, has really given permission in a way for the fossil fuel industry to continue to grow. And we know that as long as we're having cryosphere changes and we're having atmospheric CO2 continue to rise, that we're going to continue to have these cryosphere changes that are going to be detrimental both within and external to the cryosphere. So we're looking now ahead to COP29, that's going to be in November in Baku, and COP30 next year in Belém, Brazil. Baku is an important COP in many ways, being a little bit overlooked in some ways as well. But it's important because it's the last COP before the next round of NDCs, so the nationally designated contributions, which we do early in spring. And Baku is also in the cryosphere. It is in Azerbaijan, that's a mountainous country. Baku is nearly 100% reliant upon mountain resources for its needs. So we're bringing these discussions now into this region, which could be quite valuable and presents numerous opportunities in that sense. It's also the opportunity where we are going to have a decision on whether to have a third periodic review of the Paris Agreement, which would take place in 2027. Similarly to Baku being in the mountain regions, Belém, Brazil, the following year is the Amazon. It's in Brazil. So again, the Amazon being another ecosystem that has a very similar threshold to the cryosphere. We're bringing these decision makers for the second year in a row into a system that is affected at a very similar temperature threshold, and again, with impacts that extend far beyond its region. From a policy side, COP30, is also where people will be finalizing those NDCs. So it is, sort of a last straw effort to look at how to strengthen efforts towards the cryosphere in general. These NDCs would be what countries would have their emissions plans, their climate action plans strategy be for 2030 to 2035. So we're looking out, about 10 years right now. So the cryosphere is certainly telling us that 1.5 is a hard limit, that we need this 50 by 30. So that's reduction of 50% of emissions by 2030. We need to have emissions by mid-century, and we need to do so with little to no overshoot of the Paris Agreement. And so that little overshoot is maybe 0.1 degrees. So we're looking at 1.6 degree for that overshoot. So as we look towards COP29, I think it's important for us to be aware and respectful of competing urgencies. So for example, it's fine to communicate the urgency of action on the cryosphere, but this is not urgency that's going to be reflected back to us in response. So actions that we take today, we may very well take many years for us to see their impact. So having that patience, understanding the different systems, timeframes of working. But also being realistic about the economy and the growing power of the fossil fuel industry and the growing presence and financial well-being of the geoengineering community that is increasingly into these discussions. But it gives us the opportunity really to take advantage of speaking and trying to get whatever platform we can get so that we have those opportunities to speak out about the importance. But it means that we need to be tailoring what we're saying, adjusting what we're saying to the audience, avoiding uncertainty, and also avoiding sidelining science. So one example of that is something else that came out of COP28 last year was the proposal for an expert dialogue on mountains and climate change which would have been at the last SB meeting. And it was indeed at SB 60 in Bonn last year, so that was great to have. But there's debate right now as to whether that should be an annual event. So the idea is that, yes, we want to keep the momentum going, but does an annual event then become an insular community? Do we lose connection with outside policymakers? And if so, what is the long-term strategy here? And this is something that the Oceans Dialogue has experienced when it went that direction. So this is just a couple images. This was a protest that we did in Dubai last year on sea level rise, noting there's a little video, I'm not playing it over there, with me along with another scientist, Dr. Robbie Mallet, and we're in Palm Jumeirah, which was designed for 30 to 50 centimeters of sea level rise. And at current emissions, it's going to exceed a meter, but it could exceed a meter by 2070, for example. And here, Robbie is at the Museum of the Future, ironically called that here, because this is a place that could be underwater with 3 meters of sea level rise, which could not be ruled out within 100 years with current emissions. This is an image of one of our cryosphere pavilions, actually, and talks that we have going on there. So again, it's different, accessing different people and bringing in different messages. We had last year a cryosphere call, which more than 1,000 people who were involved in the cryosphere scientific community reached out and put out their voice to say that 2 degrees is too high and we need to have that limit back at 1.5. And one thing that's been mentioned several times during this week, a couple days so far, is AMI, the ambition of melting ice on sea level rise and mountain water resources. So this is something that we launched in Egypt, in Sharm el-Sheikh, COP27. And this was at the instigation of Chile and Nepal. I'm sorry, Chile and Iceland, but Nepal was one of the founding states to it, which is exciting. But what this has done, a little bit of a focus on sea level rise here, but it's taken the cryosphere and really broadened it to other countries that are not necessarily in the cryosphere. Maybe they're high emitting countries that are contributing to cryosphere damage, or they're downstream countries that are the recipient of cryosphere changes, and really widen that audience. But it's enabled us to deepen that impact on that 1.5 from a broader perspective, and also emphasize that 50 by 30 need as well. So just fitting in with AMI for a moment, there is a continued growing body of research that says that 1.5 degrees is too high. Sorry, to the 2.0 degrees is too high for the cryosphere, and that we need 1.5. That 2.5 is not enough to slow the melting of ice and contributing to sea level rise globally. We know that only the lowest emissions pathway is sufficient to prevent a long-term acceleration of something like sea level rise. And we know that many cryosphere systems, such as sea level rise, are chain reactions that will be in play long after the temperature has stabilized. So we need to have this longer term view for that. So this is just, again, from the HKH area, 1 meter in Bangladesh that we'd expect by 2030, but it will happen while some of us are still alive with current emissions, and what DACA could look like in 100 years rather than a couple thousand years. And this is a graph you're probably all familiar with, just showing the real actual importance and how much difference a small change in temperature can actually make on the cryosphere. So for us, communication with global partners is critical. We know the science, we know the economic impacts, we know the feasibility of both the climate change in the cryosphere, downstream communities, and in the action that is necessary. But what is lacking is the political will and the ability to really affect that change and have our policy makers really understand that for the cryosphere, for those downstream communities, for the global world affected by these systems, that we cannot negotiate with the point of melting ice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susanna. That was a very interesting talk indeed. Thank you for emphasizing the importance of the 1.5 degrees threshold, and also for talking about the work that ICCI and other groups are doing at COP meetings, for example, and the SUSTA meetings in Bonn, and all these are really, and also the very graphic ways you have of showing your message, showing the graphs of what sea level rise in Dakar would look like, and also standing in the sea somewhere showing what actual sea rise is going to be in other places. I'd like to invite you back to the front of the room here, and also to invite Aaron back to the front of the room. And we're going to take questions from the audience, including also from, if you have any questions online as well, please write them in the chat box, and we can cover those as well. And you can either ask a question to a certain person, or you can ask a general question, and we'll see who wants to answer it. Okay, do you have any questions in the room here? Okay, Jiraj, please go ahead. Do George, you had your hand up? Please go ahead.
Wanted to be second, but it's like that, we start. So thank you for, very interesting talks. So I'd like to start with Dr. Arvind Dr. You highlighted that the CryoHub can be a very strong power from the region to raise the voice related with cryosphere. And my question is, what would be the roles of each collaborating countries or institutions that will be joined in the network, and how it will keep running, because we need, for like a weather system, we need some energy to run. So similarly for CryoHub, I'm sure you might have some envision, like how it will keep on running. So this is very interesting. Thank you. Thank you for the, both interesting talks.
Okay, I think that's very useful. And this meeting yesterday and today was basically to talk about how we want to take forward cryosphere, right? We started the discussion last year and had some idea about it. And this year particularly was supposed to give shape to that idea in terms of what kind of organizational structure we want to create, what kind of work this hub would do, how it would organize itself. I think these are some of the things we wanted to discuss, and I believe it was discussed yesterday and today as well. So what I emphasize that, although this network is something EasyMode has started as a concept, but not just something which we thought is necessary, but through years of discussion, it was felt necessary by other, organization and partner as well. And that's why we decided to do it, transition into something like this, although it was present different from earlier. So although we have kind of initiative and taken this step, I think in the long run, I would personally like to see it, work a little bit autonomously, on itself. Coming up with its own ideas, science issues, science problems, and solutions as well. Getting its own funding, if I may say that, so that, it becomes self-functioning system and not looking at EasyMode for each and everything, right? So I think that's what I would like to see, and hope that, after this meeting, the discussion on this will continue. And it will evolve into something like that. So that's what I'm looking at, and that's the only way actually it can really do what we are talking about. Creating that mass that can voice the concern of this region about cryosphere melt, and bring it to the global fora. Like what was presented here, bringing in a lot more evidences. I think that is the way to do it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your response, Aaron, and a good challenge to the people in the room and many people online that we need this forum, the HKH CryoHub, to be autonomous and also self-sustaining so we can get the message across. Our next question is from Mr. Sonam Wangchuk.
I'd like to ask you that, because we are always talking about reaching science to policy. So can we also talk about reaching science to citizens? Because citizens are the ones who are electing policymakers. So if you work with the citizens, maybe there is an impact. Then directly working with policymakers, but we could be both ways. So if you could come into detail.
Yeah, thank you very much. So certainly, working with policymakers is twofold. One is, you're working with the policymakers that are in position, and you're also wanting to influence who gets chosen, who gets elected, and having people in position who are supportive of, cryosphere, of climate goals, of what we want. And so in that latter space, absolutely, we need to do citizen outreach, general communication as well. So for me, and I decided a couple of years ago I was going to try my hand at elected politics, just to get a little bit of this experience, and ran for office. And it was a very different experience, being elected and understanding what the those pressures were. So that was really, really good for me. But yeah, the the education of the general public is absolutely important. So that's not as much of a specific focus for us at ICCI, but I think we're much more in working with the political systems that we have that are there. So when governments change, figuring out who's who, and working with, a little bit in the COP process where it is a little bit on peer pressure and getting different governments together as well. So we're able to use that a bit. But absolutely, I think citizen science can be a great way when you're really engaging communities, because, there's that expression of, you don't want to create you don't want to have to care about the environment. You want to create a world in which the environment is naturally something that people care about. I don't remember what that expression is, but something that's intrinsically valued to us. So if you can get people to care about their local immediate community, then they are more likely to elect people who also have similar views. So we do a little bit of outreach at the community level, but not as much, not really. But I think that's a very important area, and certainly for the HKH CryoHub, very much having that community network. And also because, here is a region where people are being impacted on a daily basis. So they're both being impacted and can also have impact. So there's a nice dynamic there.
Okay, thank you very much for that response, Suzanne. And I think it's also, in some ways, also a challenge to the people in the room that it's not just ICCI's job to communicate with the general public, but the people here and the people online that part of HKH CryoHub's work should be communicating with the public as well as policymakers. Our next question is from Ghulam Raza. Please go ahead.
Hello, thank you so much. First of all, we should applaud PC Work for organizing such a wonderful event to sensitize about the cryosphere, especially the cryosphere department. Definitely, during these 2 days, we talk a lot about the permafrost glaciers, monitoring of the glaciers in all the regions of our countries. The next, we highlighted the issues, documented all those in slides and groups. My question is, what would be the next strategy to address these issues? By networking, what are the ways to contact with the larger forum of the world, like UNFCCC, ICCP, and COP, and so on. So what would be the way forward, and how to communicate that, and how to address those? Thank you so much.
Thank you once again. Actually, in my talk, I wanted to bring this up, but somehow I could not. I don't know, in the morning, Bridge was here, right? Bridge was here. So did he talk about the ministerial level mechanism we are trying to work on? No. Okay. So briefly, Chimi in her presentation yesterday talked about it, that this cryosphere and its working group will fit into what she said was institutional working group, right? What she actually meant was, we are working on a, high level regional mechanism for regional cooperation. And that's not necessarily only about cryosphere, but it is about much broader thing. Cryosphere is one element which has been taken up as first item. And then the air pollution is another item. So we had science policy dialogues related to cryosphere and very recently related to air pollution. And within that, there is a task force which is helping the high level, the ministers of our regional member countries to work on it. And within that task group, there is it has not named, but a group which is going to work on cryosphere related issue, right? So that is at that level. Now, what we are seeing is the CryoHub, which is more technical level working, can actually feed into that with technical information, what's happening, what are the challenges, right? And that higher level mechanism can more potentially bring it to, global fora. That will have a much bigger, because it is a government level, and then the government level through their, let's say in COP, their representatives can bring it. So that is the idea. That is one example which can be, very, very tangible example of how CryoHub with that, group can make a, impression at the global level. Thank you.
I can just add that, especially we saw this at COP28 last year, there was a lot of appetite to discuss the cryosphere. And that was picked up a lot more than previous years by the media, by governments. And so whilst it didn't make the operational text in the ways that we had hoped last year, there's a huge desire to really bring the cryosphere into this. So there's certainly the place for it. HKH CryoHub would need to develop its network strategies, its outreach, its connections to these organizations, but there's absolutely the space to do it. And we're having an event in September with the UN Secretary General in New York that's going to be looking at sea level rise in relation to mountains, for example. And there's the OMI strategy meetings. There's all of these global systems that are happening around the world, and there's certainly an appetite for as much cryosphere as we can bring in.
Okay, thank you very much, Suzanne. It certainly sounds like HKH CryoHub has a lot of work to do. I'd now like to ask Vijan Kayastha to give this question.
Okay, thank you very much, both of you, for your very detailed and informative presentations. I have a small comment on the 2030 emissions gaps. It's related with Suzanne. So you have shown here the historic graph in which we can see after 2020, the graph is decreasing. Is that so, or it's a projected one?
No, we are still, the projected emissions are still not sufficient they're not still on a 1.5 compatible pathway. So we need them to basically half by the end of the century, but we're not there.
No, I mean, the historic graph shows that it's decreasing around 2020. Is that the actual one?
No, I think that's an older graph.
Oh, older graph. Oh, okay. Thank you.
Yes.
Okay, thanks, Susan. Shrestha, please can you go ahead with your question?
Yeah. Thank you again, both of you, for your time and also the CryoHub initiative. I'd like to link what Dr. Arun had said initially regarding that quantity can affect quality, right? If I told it correctly. Okay, as you mentioned, we are like 4.
Not every time, but
Yeah. I mean, like you said, we are like 4 billion people that sustain on this HKH region. And somehow I believe, and it's my bias and it's secretly I'm putting it into a question for Susanna, that do you really think that the global community is actually willing to either invest their resources or their time in a region that might not be so economically profitable? I'm not sure if I put the question right way, but I'm just wondering from a perspective of if they were, I mean, we should already have investigated a lot in science and things like that. So I'm just wondering, and again, I said that I come with a bit of insecurity and biases. So I'd like to have your opinion on this. So thank you.
No, excellent. Thank you for that question. And I think that's a lot of where that lack of political will is, because there are certainly, we have been able to take greater steps in the past. We are able to take greater steps in the future than we have either taken before or necessarily want to take. There is a lot of going back to some point about the elections and the policymakers. What are people doing to stay in policy? So there's a lot of missed opportunities, and there will continue to be a lot of missed opportunities. But I think seeing now a lot more global cryosphere events, a lot more global disasters, we're seeing stronger cyclones, we're seeing the blocks, we're seeing these that haven't been on people's radars before. And there are a lot more people who are impacted now than have been before. And once people start to realize that this is something that happens to me, it's not something that happens somewhere else. When you start to make those connections between changes, picking on the cryosphere, between changes in the cryosphere and impacts around the world, these feedbacks, I think that's where we can really start to accelerate that action. But it is a matter of, really getting that political will as well.
I can just add, I remember that cafe that Sonam was actually leading, right? And I intervened for some time and asked, why is Afghanistan in the wrong place? But that's not the point I'm going to raise now. He asked if Bangladesh should be mentioned in that discussion. And earlier we did not understand, but what he explained was that well, there are no cryosphere scientists probably in Bangladesh, but shouldn't policy and decision maker be aware of what's happening in the upstream with the cryosphere and what it might mean for Bangladesh, right? So that is awareness and understanding of cryosphere. So even at our regional level, I think we have that kind of gap, which is by itself is something which we need to work. As you have said, yes, 1.9 billion people if we count all the river basin, but in terms of awareness of what is happening, in terms of acknowledging the importance of what is happening, even in this region, it is not adequate, let alone global awareness. So we really need to work on it. And again, things like the sea level rise probably brings together all those upstreams and downstream. Food security, for example, in Indus Basin, more than majority water is from meltwater, from cryosphere, right? So if the meltwater declines, the agricultural productivity will decline. And this agricultural productivity means it is, it will impact global food price, grain price, right? So these kind of things actually make impact at global level. And we need to bring in this kind of details more and more. Thank you.
Thank you. And an important point that you don't have to look at closer cryosphere to be affected by it. And I know the ambition of melting ice has had active participation previously from Bangladesh. Do we have any more questions? We're getting close to the end of the session. Okay, Carmen, please go ahead.
Just a quick question to the on the CryoHub. CryoHub, from my perspective, is a very interesting platform. And the very objective of this such a platform, trying to create such a platform, is to share data information. And I understand that this is not the first time has been trying to form this kind of forums and platforms. And one of the main driving force behind this, if we need to succeed with this such kind of common data sharing, information sharing platform, especially in our region, is the political willingness. So I don't know how it's more as a lead in this one. You try to address this issue.
Thanks. Shall I start? Yeah. No, as you have said, data sharing has been there all the time, right? So in terms of success, probably we are not in a satisfactory level. So I think you have answered yourself. Is that and the way I also answered to Dheeraj about this is that now probably we need to think of a different approach, not just easy mode always calling for certain actions, right? Data sharing, for example. If this forum is, if this hub is actually, run by multiple stakeholders, multiple partners, from multiple countries, I think that we have a better chance for this to move forward. I think this is something I believe that, the regional member country itself driving it probably would actually make it happen. Yesterday I saw this vicious circle of mistrust, which actually is not a circle but a spiral which goes down. And I hope this actually creates a conducive environment and a circle which goes up, right? Progresses with time. It is difficult. It is a slow process, but unless we really, work on it, and that's why I thought we should add in another forum actually, for that forum we need, also patience and passion. going together. So I think this is a long process, but I think unless we do it, it will not happen. Thank you.
Okay, do we have any more questions? In that case, this isn't really a panel discussion, but I'd like to offer the two speakers the opportunity to give a very brief closing statement, so we can start with you, Susanna.
Well, I think my closing statement is just that you don't need to live in the cryosphere to be affected by it. And we're seeing these changes that are increasingly escalating around the world, and that more and more people beyond the 1.9 billion people who live in HKH are impacted by changes in this region. And those changes are only going to escalate, and they're going to escalate as long as we continue to let our emissions increase, our CO2 to increase, our temperatures to rise. So we have a choice, and it is our choice to make, but it's up to us, but it's also up to, the people with whom we speak, the people we elect, the people that we want to speak on our behalf. So I think the education, going back to that point, I think that's absolutely critical. I think the outreach, I think involving communities, because I think it's also empowering that if you're being impacted by something, that you're able to take positive action to make some change for yourself as well. And we know from other experiments that acting positively on the cryosphere will lead to positive benefits, and we can stave off the worst of the global impacts from cryosphere loss.
At the closer, I would really wish that the CryoHub, moves ahead and does what it really needs to do. There was a discussion about science policy and citizen. I also would like to say that we quite a lot of times say science-based policy or science-informed policy, right? And that's what we try to work for. But I think it is also important to have policy supported or policy demanded science. Why not? Right? So, this again becomes another vicious circle for you if you want to take, right? But it's a positive vicious circle. Science feeds to the policy, and based on that science information, policy actually demands certain science, right? And that goes on and on. And that's a spiral that goes up, really, unlike the vicious circle of mistrust. So I really hope that, we can contribute to that and not just feed the policy sphere with science, but also be ready to take, the policy demanded science and work on it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aaron, and thank you very much, Susanna. This brings us to the end of the session, so thank you to both the speakers very much. And thank you also to a very attentive audience, both here in the room and online. Thank you.
Thank you so much.